The cold billionaire wanted his wife to disappear, and when that cruel wish came true, what she left behind made him scream inside an empty mansion. Elliot Kane was the kind of man who could buy silence with money, but that night his words became the only thing he couldn't take back. Standing in his glass office, he said into the phone, "Her presence irritates me. I wish she'd disappear forever." His assistant laughed softly. Elliot didn't. The next morning, the mansion felt wrong, like no one had ever lived there. Her coffee cup sat half full, her shoes were gone, and her wedding ring glimmered on the counter like a final breath. He called her name once, then twice. Only the echo answered. By the time he opened her journal, the world he'd built began to collapse. Each line cut deeper than any scandal could. Power couldn't save him now, because the woman he erased had just written his ending. If you've ever wished someone gone, think twice. You may not survive what their absence leaves behind. Grace Whitmore moved through the mansion like a shadow that forgot how to breathe. The marble floors echoed her steps, but no one ever looked up. Elliot called her "my wife" at business dinners, the same way he referred to a watch or a property. Never Grace. She often stood by the window, painting sunsets she could never touch. In the soft light, her reflection looked like someone else, a stranger wearing her old face. Once, she had dreamed of art shows, of laughter, of a man who saw her. Now she measured her days by the sound of closing doors. Every room in that mansion had her fingerprints, yet it felt like a museum of someone already gone. Elliot's presence filled every corner with silence, heavy and cold. He built empires. She vanished in them. Sometimes, when she caught her own name in the mail, she whispered it aloud, just to remember how it sounded. Because in this house, even her voice had become invisible. At first, Grace believed quiet love could heal loud distance. She smiled through forgotten dinners, unlit birthdays, and promises that died between board meetings. Elliot always said, "We'll celebrate later." Later never came. She learned to eat alone, to sleep facing the empty side of the bed. She told herself this was marriage, patience, sacrifice, endurance. But each silent night carved a small hole inside her, and the more she tried to keep peace, the more she disappeared. There were days she'd leave notes on his desk, tiny reminders like, "I miss us." He never replied. He didn't even notice when the notes stopped. Grace began to understand. You don't have to die to stop existing. Sometimes it just takes one person who stops seeing you. The first time she lost the baby, she waited for him in the hospital. He sent flowers instead of showing up. The second time, she didn't call. She signed the forms alone, writing "unavailable" where her husband's name should have been. Her body ached, but her heart was quieter than the machines beside her. She opened her journal and wrote, "I lost our baby today." He never knew. Back at home, the house stood the same, flawless, unfeeling. Elliot came in late that night talking about stocks and headlines. He never noticed the hospital band still on her wrist. In that silence, something in Grace broke for good. Not from anger, but from the certainty that she was truly alone. Money filled every space between them, except the one where love was supposed to live. Elliot's name filled magazines, awards, and gala invitations. He shook hands, made deals, collected applause. He was the man everyone wanted to be, except the man his wife needed. Grace spent her nights in the art room, brushes dry, colors fading. She painted skies without light, faces without eyes. Each canvas looked more like a goodbye. He came home only to change suits, to check emails, to remind her of what she owed to his image. And still, she waited. Not for him, but for proof that she still mattered. Elliot owned everything money could touch, but the price was her soul, paid quietly, piece by piece. He owned the world, but lost the woman who gave it meaning. That night, Grace sat alone in the dim art room, staring at the unfinished canvas. Elliot's words replayed like a curse. "Her presence irritates me." They cut through her chest, sharp and final. The man she once believed in had turned her love into noise. She closed her eyes and heard another voice, soft and wise, from years ago. Her grandmother had once said, "Baby girl, the day you make yourself small to fit into someone's life is the day you need to walk away." Grace had smiled back then, thinking love meant staying. Now, those words felt like truth spoken too early. The house around her glowed with cold light, beautiful and empty. She realized she had been shrinking for years. Her voice, her art, her laughter, all folded away to make space for his ego. Her hands trembled as she whispered into the quiet, "Grandma, I hear you now." In that whisper, something inside her shifted. Not rage, not revenge, just the quiet beginning of an ending. By dawn, her decision had ripened into clarity. Grace moved quietly through the sleeping mansion, collecting fragments of her old life. A photo, her grandmother's locket, a folder of unfinished sketches. She took nothing else. In their bedroom, she laid her wedding ring on the marble counter beside an envelope. Inside was her letter, written through tears. "You married me to save your name. I married you believing I could teach a stone to love." Next to it, she placed her journal, its pages filled with silence that had waited too long to speak. The room looked untouched, but something invisible had broken. She stood for a moment, taking one last look at everything money could buy. None of it was hers anymore. Grace whispered a prayer without words and closed the door behind her. No luggage, no goodbye, only freedom in its purest form, leaving without needing to be seen. The first light of morning crept over Charleston. The sky shimmered with pink and gold as Grace stepped outside. The air was cool, carrying the smell of magnolia and salt. She took a deep breath that felt like her first in years. The mansion loomed behind her, perfect and lifeless. Its windows reflected nothing, just emptiness. She didn't look back. She had already spent too long turning around for someone who never noticed. Her footsteps were soft but certain. For every step forward, the weight on her chest lightened. She wasn't escaping, she was returning, to herself. When the sunlight touched her face, she stopped and smiled faintly. For years, she had lived unseen, fading in someone else's shadow. For the first time, she felt visible. Somewhere, a car door closed. The sound was small but final. Grace Whitmore had disappeared. But for the first time in her life, she finally existed. Morning came heavy with silence. Elliot stirred, annoyed by the stillness, unaware it was the sound of loss. No smell of coffee, no faint hum of Grace's music, just air that felt wrong. He called her name once, then again, nothing. Then he saw it, the ring on the counter, her journal on the bed. The sight struck harder than any betrayal could. He picked up the journal, his hands trembling. The first lines were simple, almost gentle, but each one carried pain he'd never cared to see. He read, then froze. Her loneliness spilled across the page like confession, and suddenly the silence cracked. A hoarse, broken scream filled the halls. He had wished her gone, and now she was. Her absence was louder than her presence ever was. The echo bounced off the marble walls until it faded into nothing. The sound of a man finally realizing what he had destroyed. Elliot sat on the edge of the bed, the journal open in shaking hands. The handwriting was small, graceful, alive. The first entries spoke of hope, her excitement, her laughter, her love for him. He could almost hear her voice again. But then the tone changed. Every page became a slow unraveling. "You come home smelling like money, not life. I smile so you won't feel guilty for forgetting me." Each sentence tore through him, a mirror reflecting the man he had become. He turned another page, then stopped. A dried petal fell from the crease, a reminder of something she once cared about. He didn't remember where it came from. The last entry was short. "If you ever notice my absence, remember, it started long before I left." Elliot closed the book slowly. His chest ached. The empire he built suddenly felt weightless, because nothing he owned could drown out the truth written in her silence. Elliot turned another page. The word stopped him cold. Miscarriage. He blinked, thinking he read it wrong. Then came the second entry. Another loss. His stomach twisted. He dropped the book, ran to the sink, and vomited until his throat burned. She had been bleeding, and he had been in meetings. The thought cracked his chest open. Her words blurred in front of his eyes. I lost our baby today. You never knew. I didn't call because I already knew you wouldn't come. He pressed the journal to his face as if he could erase the words. But they were carved too deep. Into her, into him. He saw her in the hospital light, alone, holding nothing but pain. He remembered every time she smiled and said she was fine. She had been screaming quietly, and he never heard. Elliot collapsed to the floor. The marble felt colder than he remembered. The empire he built was made of her silence, and now it echoed around him like a curse. Margaret Kane arrived without warning. She stood in the doorway, her eyes sharp and grieving. The journal lay open beside her son. You didn't know because you never looked, she said. Her voice was steady, the kind that could slice through guilt. Elliot tried to speak, but his mouth only formed apologies that sounded too small. She was your wife, not your employee, Margaret continued. You checked reports, not people. He lowered his head. I thought I was giving her everything. Margaret shook hers. Everything but yourself. The silence stretched heavy between them. For the first time she saw her powerful son as a frightened boy. You built a castle so high, she whispered. You couldn't hear her crying beneath it. Elliot's voice cracked. I didn't know how bad it was. Her reply was colder than the air. Because you never wanted to know. She turned toward the door, leaving him with her final words still hanging in the room like judgment. He sat in her room all night, clutching her journal, until guilt became unbearable. Hours later, Elliot followed his mother into the hall. His voice trembled. I have to find her, Mom. I need to fix this. Margaret stopped. Her back remained straight, unyielding. You don't get to fix what you destroyed to make yourself feel better. He froze. The words hit harder than any punishment. I just want to tell her I'm sorry. You want forgiveness, she said, not change. He took a step closer, desperate. Please, tell me where she is. Margaret turned around slowly. Her eyes softened, but didn't forgive. She doesn't owe you the closure you denied her. The air thickened with everything unsaid. When she walked away, the echo of her heels sounded like a verdict. The door closed between them, sharp and final. Elliot stood in the silence he had created, surrounded by everything he once thought he owned. For the first time he realized loneliness wasn't her curse. It was his inheritance. The next day, Margaret returned briefly. She handed him an envelope. She wanted you to have this, she said quietly. Inside was a single note written in Grace's calm handwriting. I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because anger would keep me tied to you. Elliot stared at the paper until the words blurred. Forgiveness wasn't comfort. It was release. Her freedom, not his redemption. Margaret's voice broke the silence. She's healing, Elliot. Let her. He nodded slowly, though the tears came anyway. It was the first time he cried for something he couldn't control. He whispered, How can she forgive me? Margaret answered softly, because she finally learned to love herself more than she loved your approval. When she left again, he didn't stop her. The note trembled in his hands, light as paper, heavy as truth. 2 days later, Daniel Kane knocked on his brother's door. Elliot opened it, unshaven, hollow-eyed. Daniel said nothing, only handed him a tablet. Watch this. The video showed Grace at a small community center, reading poetry to a room of women. Her voice was steady, full of warmth. Elliot's breath caught. She helped me after my accident, Daniel said quietly. She showed up when you didn't. Elliot watched Grace smile, the same smile he hadn't seen in years. She looked alive, free. She saved people, Elliot, even me, Daniel continued. Elliot nodded slowly, tears rising. She found purpose in what I broke. Daniel put a hand on his shoulder. Maybe that's her victory. For a long time, neither spoke. The only sound was the faint echo of Grace's voice from the video, a woman reborn through the pain he gave her. Daniel sat across from his brother, calm but heavy with something Elliot didn't want to hear. "She came to see me," he said quietly, 3 times a week, for almost a year. Elliot frowned. "Why?" Daniel looked down. "Because I was broken, and she refused to let me give up." He turned the tablet toward him again, and another video, Grace laughing, encouraging him to take his first steps after therapy. "She was more family to me than you ever were." The words landed like glass shattering. Elliot wanted to argue, to defend himself, but every excuse died before reaching his lips. He saw himself in Daniel, a man she had saved, not through love, but through the pain he caused her. Daniel continued, voice low. "She said once, 'Some people destroy you, and you still want to see them healed.' That's the kind of woman she was." Elliot closed his eyes. "And I never saw her." "No," Daniel said, standing slowly. "You just looked past her." The silence between them was long and sharp, a mirror Elliot couldn't turn away from. Daniel lingered by the door. His tone was softer now, but final. "You erased her, Elliot," he said. "You didn't hurt her with cruelty. You hurt her with indifference." Elliot's jaw trembled. "I didn't mean to." "That's the problem. You never mean to. You just don't care enough to stop." The words stripped him bare. He looked around. The mansion, the art, the trophies, all relics of a life that had no meaning anymore. Daniel's eyes filled with tears he didn't let fall. "She showed me what love looks like, even when she had none left to give. And you only loved the sound of your own success." Elliot reached out, but Daniel stepped back. "You wanted to win everything," he said. "Now you've won emptiness." Then Daniel turned and walked away. The door clicked shut. Elliot sank to his knees, surrounded by everything he'd built from her silence. In that moment he finally understood. Guilt wasn't punishment. It was truth made visible. Days passed without a single voice in the house. Elliot tried to work, to eat, to sleep, but silence filled every space. Even his own reflection began to feel like a stranger. The mansion that once echoed with power now mocked him. Every room was too large, too empty, too alive with memories. He had chased noise all his life, applause, deals, headlines, but this silence was louder than all of it. He wandered the halls like a ghost, touching objects that meant nothing. The smell of her perfume still lingered faintly in the air. He whispered her name once, just to hear it again. It sounded foreign coming from his mouth. Money couldn't soften the ache. Power couldn't fill the absence. The empire he built had no pulse without the woman who once stood quietly behind it. For the first time, Elliot understood poverty. Not the lack of wealth, but the absence of someone who gave your life meaning. One morning, Elliot called his lawyer. Within a week, the Charleston mansion was on the market. He packed a few clothes, a photograph of Grace, and left everything else behind. He moved to a small apartment near the city's old quarter. No staff, no noise, no audience. He found work with a non-profit legal center that helped women in financial distress. At first, he only donated. Then he started showing up, cleaning, organizing, answering phones. The volunteers whispered his name, shocked that the Elliot Kane was there sweeping floors. But for the first time, he didn't feel above anyone. He felt human. He didn't come to fix women like Grace. He came to listen to them. Each story he heard was another mirror, reflecting the pain he'd ignored. And every time he helped, a small piece of his guilt loosened. It wasn't redemption. It was work. Slow, necessary work. Months later, Elliot was delivering documents near a community center. The mural outside stopped him cold. Bright colors, brushstrokes he recognized. Grace's signature at the corner, GW. Inside, he found the art room she had built. Canvases lined the walls. Women painting, laughing, alive. One of them looked up. "You're Grace's husband, aren't you?" He nodded slowly. Another woman said, "She felt real here, Because you made her feel invisible." Elliot's throat tightened. He wanted to speak, to apologize, but words failed. They showed him photos. Grace smiling, holding paint-stained hands, teaching children. "She gave us hope," one woman said, "the kind she never got from you." He stood there, surrounded by color, and felt the full weight of what he'd stolen. Everything he was seeing, joy, community, life, was built from the pain he had left behind. For the first time, Elliot didn't cry out of guilt. He cried out of understanding. He returned the next day, unable to stay away from the place that carried her name. As Elliot listened, one of the women spoke softly. "She came here the morning after you said those words." He frowned, confused. "What words?" The woman met his eyes. "You wished she'd disappear. She said she'd give you what you wanted." The words hit him like a collapse from inside. He felt the floor tilt beneath him. Grace had heard him. She had left because of that single, careless sentence. Another woman added, "She didn't leave in anger. She said she wanted peace. She said disappearing was the only way to survive." Elliot's knees weakened. He sat down, covering his face with shaking hands. He had spent years believing her silence was weakness. Now he saw it was strength. The quiet act of saving herself from him. Tears rolled down, hot and unstoppable. He whispered, "She heard me," and she obeyed. A voice behind him replied, "No, Mr. Kane. She didn't obey. She freed herself." For the first time, Elliot cried not for forgiveness, but for the truth, because he finally understood the difference. Before he left, one of the women handed him an envelope. "She wanted us to give you this if you ever came." The paper was soft, worn, handled often. Elliot unfolded it carefully. Grace's handwriting bloomed across the page. "Helping others made me visible again." He read it twice, then again, as if the ink itself could explain her heart. She had built light out of darkness, connection out of neglect. Her absence had created something living, a place full of color and hope. He pressed the letter to his chest and closed his eyes. In that moment, something inside him shifted. It wasn't peace, not yet, but a beginning. The first light seeping into the long night he had built for himself. He whispered, "You found your way, Grace. Now I have to find mine." And, for the first time, the path ahead didn't terrify him. Weeks later, Elliot stood before a small group of men seated in folding chairs. The sign behind them read, "Support Circle for Men Healing from Emotional Harm." He cleared his throat, unsteady. "I'm not here to talk about success," he began. "I'm here because I spent years feeling nothing, and I destroyed the only person who ever felt everything." The room was silent. He continued, "You're not a monster for feeling nothing. You become one when you refuse to see." Heads nodded slowly. One man whispered, "How did you change?" Elliot answered honestly, "By losing someone who deserved better, and realizing too late that love isn't about being right. It's about being present." After the session, he sat outside under the pale sky. He still carried guilt, but it no longer owned him. He was beginning to live differently, not to erase what he'd done, but to ensure he never became blind again. One afternoon, a woman named Simone approached him at the center. She carried a file of donation letters. "These were from Grace Whitmore," she said. Elliot froze. Simone continued, "She supported this place before it even opened. She wrote this note with her first check." He read the short message written in Grace's neat handwriting. "You don't have to be hit to be hurt." Simone smiled gently. She helped hundreds of women who thought their pain didn't count. Elliot felt his throat tighten. Grace had turned her wounds into protection for others. He whispered, "She saved lives with what I destroyed." Simone nodded. "That's what strength looks like." He placed the letter back in its envelope. Every act of kindness she left behind was a monument to the life she reclaimed. For the first time, he felt proud of her. Not as his wife, but as herself. That evening, Daniel visited him again. He looked lighter than before, almost at peace. "She's doing well," he said softly. "She's living in Oregon now. She's free." Elliot's voice shook. Has she forgiven me? Daniel nodded slowly. She has. But her forgiveness isn't an invitation, Elliot. It's her release. The words stung, but they were true. Grace hadn't forgiven to comfort him. She had done it to untie herself from the pain. Daniel added, She still asks about Mom. She wants you to know she hopes you're trying. Elliot smiled faintly, eyes wet. I am. Every day. Daniel placed a hand on his shoulder. Then maybe that's enough. When he left, Elliot stayed by the window, watching the city lights flicker. He realized forgiveness wasn't a door back to her. It was the bridge that finally let her walk away. Months passed quietly. Elliot no longer chased headlines or applause. He began something different. The Visibility Project, a foundation to help women escape emotional neglect and rebuild their lives. The name carried no hint of his identity. That was the point. He used his own fortune to fund shelters, therapy programs, and education grants. He didn't speak at openings. He stayed behind the scenes, stacking boxes, answering phones, learning how to serve instead of lead. People asked why he kept his name off the project. His answer was simple. This isn't redemption. It's responsibility. Each success story reminded him of Grace, the invisible woman who had taught him how to see. He still wore his wedding ring, not as a bond, but as a reminder of the vow he had broken and the life it had cost. At night, he looked over the list of women they'd helped and whispered, This is for you, Grace, for every part of you I didn't protect. He had finally learned that real power wasn't about control. It was about giving others back their visibility. One rainy evening, Elliot sat by the window of his small apartment. The city lights flickered across the paper before him. He had written countless letters he never sent, but this one felt different. It wasn't for forgiveness. It was closure. He began, simply, Thank you for surviving me. The words looked strange but true, and he continued, I'll spend the rest of my life making sure your pain saves others. The woman I failed became the voice that changed me. You taught me what love costs, and what it should give. He paused, letting the ink dry. Outside, thunder rolled across the horizon. He folded the letter, placed it in an envelope, and tucked it inside the first donation file for the Visibility Project. He whispered, Wherever you are, I hope you're seen, truly seen. For the first time, he didn't ache for her return. He just hoped she was free. Weeks later, Daniel came by with quiet eyes and a faint smile. She wanted me to tell you, he said. Elliot looked up, his heart tightening. Tell me what? Grace is engaged. She's happy. For a long moment, Elliot said nothing. His throat burned, but his lips curved into a small smile. She's finally seen, Daniel added softly, by someone who knows how to love her. Elliot nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. That's the ending she deserved. They sat together in silence, letting the truth settle. It didn't hurt like before. It healed. Grace had rebuilt a life beyond his shadow, and somehow that made his own journey feel complete. When Daniel left, Elliot stood by the window. Rain streaked down the glass, blurring the city lights into gold. He whispered, Be happy, Grace. And for the first time his tears felt like gratitude, not grief. Time softened everything, but didn't erase it. Elliot still woke some mornings with guilt beside him, but it no longer ruled his days. He understood now. Forgiveness wasn't about forgetting. It was about releasing the weight. Grace had found freedom in letting go. He had found a purpose in carrying what he'd done. He shared this with new volunteers at the Visibility Project. When you hurt someone, you don't erase it by saying sorry, he told them. You heal it by becoming someone who never hurts that way again. Every word he spoke carried the quiet honesty of a man rebuilt from regret. He didn't seek redemption anymore. He simply tried to honor the lesson Grace had left behind, that love without empathy is emptiness disguised as power, and with that truth he finally forgave himself, just enough to keep moving forward. Years later, the Visibility Project thrived. A mural of vibrant colors covered its front wall. women of every age standing in the light, their faces strong and radiant. At the bottom, in quiet lettering, it read, "For Grace Whitmore, who taught us to be seen." Elliot often visited in the early morning before anyone arrived. He traced the painted words with his fingertips, whispering her truth like prayer. Love without presence isn't love. Money without empathy is nothing. And sometimes, the greatest act of love is letting someone be free. He looked up at the mural, Grace's smile among the painted faces, and felt peace. If she could see him now, he hoped she'd recognize not the man he once was, but the one she helped him become. As he turned to leave, his voice was barely a whisper. If you've ever felt invisible, remember you deserve to be seen. He paused by the doorway, gazing at the city waking up beyond the glass. Then, softly added, "Share this story, for every Grace who found the courage to walk away. And if it touched you, subscribe, stay with us, because every story like hers deserves to be heard and never forgotten."